For the Podcast 99 Network, I'm Alex Ross with the news. A major fire has engulfed one of France's most famous landmarks, the medieval Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, which is over 850 years old. Firefighters are battling to save the cathedral, but its spire and roof have now collapsed. And while the cause is not yet clear, officials say that it could be linked to recent renovation work. The Paris prosecutor's office has also opened an inquiry into accidental destruction by fire. Several other churches around the French capital have been ringing their bells in response to the blaze, and French President Emmanuel Macron, once he had arrived at the scene, said that his thoughts were with all Catholics and with all French people. A 75-year-old man has been killed in Florida after he was attacked by his pet cassowary. Similar in appearance to emus, cassowaries are among the largest and heaviest of flightless bird species in the world, weighing up to 100 pounds, able to run 30 miles an hour, and with a 5-inch claw on each foot. The cassowary's owner, identified as Marvin Havos, was discovered by county sheriffs and taken to the hospital by paramedics, but he later died of his injuries. In a statement to a local newspaper, Deputy Chief Jeff Taylor said that, "My understanding is that the gentleman was in the vicinity of the bird and at some point fell. When he fell, he was attacked." Police also noted that the bird involved with the incident remains at the property. And on this day in history, in 1947, multimillionaire and financier Bernard Baruch, in a speech given during the unveiling of his portrait in the South Carolina House of Representatives, coins the term Cold War to describe the relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. The phrase stuck, and for over 40 years it was a mainstay in the language of American diplomacy. For the Podcast 99 Network, I'm Alex Ross.
Buy with Rob is your best choice when purchasing your new home in the Puget Sound area. Call 360-710-9425 today and get started on the best home buying experience you will ever have.
No, I just read the back where it's printed in French.
You speak French?
Sure, they love me in France.
Hey, this is YD from the Ale Evangelist Show, and you're listening to the Podcast 99 Internet Radio Network.
Hey, did I tell you guys I got a goat?
The President is hereby empowered to designate as alien enemies any citizens or subjects of hostile nations residing in the United States whose presence he regards as dangerous, and make regulations for their apprehension, restraint, or removal.
Both the House and the Senate believe the country's security requires it, sir.
There are over 25,000 Frenchmen in Philadelphia alone, Mr. President. Refugees from the slave uprisings in the Caribbean. We must assume their sympathies remain with France rather than America.
If war does come, we can't afford to harbour potential spies in our midst.
Little column A, little column B.
Yeah, baby!
Well, good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, wherever you are, whatever you do. A lot of things happening in the world today. Most of them are far beyond our control, you might say. So perhaps it's time we took a pause and thought about life and thought about the laws of gravity, fires, history, religion, enlightenment, life, death, resurrection, and or the news. Don't touch that dial. Just try to hear me out for a while. Like many of you, I watched with some emotion yesterday as the Notre Dame Cathedral burned. The reactions were as varied as there are people, from anguish to even joy. I'm not kidding. As the flame rose, we watched the symbol of the past try to teach us about ourselves again. The first lesson being that Notre Dame is coming back. She always has. What else is new? Am I right? Here's how you get a hold of me. The text machine is area code 209-565-DAVE. That's 209-565-3283. The email, dave@thedavebowmanshow.com. And of course, we're on the web. Just use your preferred non-denominational web search browser to take you to thedavebowmanshow.com. Ego biberi capulas et olive verve. I drink coffee that others might live. It's particularly good this morning. I'm not sure why. I must have done something different, but I don't know what it was. So I'm off and running this morning. Like you, yesterday was one of those days where you watch what's going on and you're somewhere between disbelief and incredulity, I guess. I'm not really sure where you were. I know where I was, mentally speaking. I know where many of you that texted me and sent me messages were, and It's remarkable that a building can have that much effect on people. Now, I say that having been to a building myself, several buildings myself that were of particular interest to me. I've never been to Paris. I've always wanted to go to Paris. I've never really had the opportunity to go to Paris. And so the Notre Dame Cathedral was never on my agenda. It's not something I've ever done. I have been to London, where one fine afternoon I spent the afternoon in Westminster Abbey, which, by the way, was played by the Notre Dame Cathedral in the Da Vinci Code movies. I guess in the back of my head I knew that, but I didn't really realize it until yesterday when I was looking at the pictures. I was, wait, that's Westminster Abbey. No, wait, that's... Anyway, Westminster Abbey is a fascinating building. It's similar to Notre Dame in the sense that it's a very old building. It's 1,000 years old. There's a great deal of history in it, and it was a remarkable day to me. I mean, it really was. It was one of those days of great realization. You know, I don't want to be too personal here, but it was a day that I realized that my former wife and I were on two different paths. As we were walking through the Poets' Corner at Westminster Abbey, Dylan Thomas's grave is here, and Geoffrey Chaucer's ossuary is there, and I'm standing with my hands on Geoffrey Chaucer's ossuary, the bones of Geoffrey Chaucer. And I turned to her to say, "Isn't this remarkable?" And she was looking around for the tour guide to ask where was Elton John's piano during Princess Di's funeral. And I realized at that point we were kind of on two different paths. At any rate, Notre Dame is something I'd never seen, I've never been to, and I've always wanted to go, but I've lived vicariously through my friends that have gone and have posted their pictures and their thoughts and their visions of what happened at Notre Dame. And, you know, again, there's a dichotomy here that we have to keep in mind. Number one, this is a religious building. This is a church. It is a Roman Catholic church. France has a long history with the Roman Catholic Church. In fact, the source of much conflict through the years has been France's Catholicism versus England's, you know, Anglicanism, whatever you want to call it, and other countries as well. The remarkable thing, though, about these buildings is, even though it's a church, it's also a historical monument in many ways. And when you think about what went into this building in the 1200s, building the initial part of this cathedral, and one of the things I found most impressive yesterday was they were talking to one of the historians there, was talking about the fact that they don't even know the names of the artisans that built it, because the artisans that built it wanted the glory to go to God, not themselves. You would never get that today. Today you would get a builder's plate on it that said, you know, this politician was responsible, this politician was here, this politician was there, this politician was there, and at the very bottom it would say who built it. You know, this company was the main contractor or whatever. It's such a remarkable idea. And these churches I find them fascinating. Again, I am not Roman Catholic. I'm not even Christian, but I find them fascinating to go into because of there's a linchpin here, if you will. There is a relationship that the United States has with France that goes back, of course, to the 1780s when France helped us in the American Revolution. But even more so than that, most of the writers of the Enlightenment, most of the minds of the Enlightenment, the men who inspired Thomas Jefferson and his words in the Declaration of Independence, the words that inspired James Madison in his writings and his ideas with the Constitution and so forth. Most of those Enlightenment authors come from France. Many of Montesquieu, some of the others as well, come from France. They came from France in the 1740s, 1750s, in that era of Enlightenment, when France, which had been so dominated by religion for so long, began to break free of those constraints. Now, before you get judgmental here, I want you to think about some things. England dominated us, but while there was a religious element to that, you can hardly say that the English Empire, the British Empire, Great Britain, the British Empire, you can hardly say that it was ever built on a religious basis. I mean, yes, the king or queen took a vow to the Anglican Church, and I get all that, but very rarely, especially once you got past Elizabeth I, very rarely did these kings guide their foreign policy and their dealings with stuff based on religion. Now, there was a religious element to it, and I don't want to dismiss that, but it wasn't necessarily there. The opposite is true in France. France is a religious theocracy. The king is sworn to uphold the Holy Catholic Church. He is beholden to the Pope in many ways. And it's, by the time you get into the 1740s and 1750s in France, it is for all practical purposes a theology. The church runs everything. The king gives his assent to what the church wants to do, but there is a lot of control by the church, the bishops in particular, but there's a hierarchy as well. And this whole thing becomes very, what's the word I'm looking for? It becomes very stressful. And the average Frenchman comes to really resent the priesthood, the bishops, and the church as well. And the Enlightenment, we talk about our separation of church and state. We talk about our ideas about freedom of religion. Well, remember, a lot of that came from the Enlightenment, the ideas that, we didn't like the Church of England, but we didn't like necessarily the Catholic Church either, but we also didn't like the way the Catholic Church in France was suppressing Protestants. Protestants in France were not allowed to marry legally. They couldn't hold office. They couldn't own property. They couldn't do any of those things. And as the Enlightenment began to take hold, as it began to resonate with the average Frenchman, there became a lot of resentment towards that and a lot of political movement out of the Enlightenment to force the king to do away with those laws. And in fact, Louis was compelled to, I guess is a better way to put it. Maybe he even felt that it was the right thing to do to allow Protestants to become married. He didn't let them hold office, but own property, those kinds of things, and sort of an emancipation of Protestantism in France. And this, of course, made the clergy mad, the Catholic clergy mad, and so they started cranking down even more, raising tithes of the average people. Of course, they were tax exempt, and there was a lot of resentment. And I don't think you really grasp how much there was, how much backlash there was against that. You can never go wrong reading Will Durant, I will tell you that right now. And I spent a lot of time last night in here reading about the resentment, the tension that was growing in France. And, in the middle of Paris stands this monument to Catholic control, Roman Catholic control over the average Frenchman on a given day. And as more and more people became enlightened, and I use that term in the context of the Enlightenment, not in the sense of suddenly they became brilliant, the church really began to suffer. People stopped going to church. People stopped paying their tithes. People stopped sending their children to school. In fact, Louis at one point refused to allow the priests to teach his son. Why? Because even some of the lower level priests were becoming agnostic based on the teachings of the Enlightenment. All of this to say that the Notre Dame Cathedral, still standing there, becomes a focal point during the French Revolution. Now, the French Revolution starts with, the overthrow of the monarchy, which we liked as Americans. We were all, down with the monarchy, up with the republic. We were all for that. We were all with that. Until it started getting, what's the word for it, wackadoodle? Or I guess technically whack-a-mole. When they started cutting off everybody's head that disagreed with them, including, by the way, they threatened and they arrested him. He went over there to be supportive of their ideas, but they arrested Thomas Paine, our Thomas Paine, the guy that wrote the pamphlet. They arrested him and they were going to execute him. They were going to cut his head, guillotine his head off. Why? Just because he wasn't freaking wackadoodle enough for them. I don't know. Things went crazy in France from 1789 to 1799. Things were just insane. And you can make an argument that It was the Enlightenment gone too far. It was the ideas of humanism taken too far. Perhaps taken out of context, perhaps taken out of whatever. One of the writers that I was reading about last night talked about the fact that the Enlightenment always struggled with the idea that, if the Catholic Church had become a theocracy in France, it had at least given it a moral underpinning that the Enlightenment never could come up with. They could never find a moral basis for what they were espousing. And because they, this is the problem, I think, to some degree with libertarianism today. If you ask 100 people, what's the definition of libertarianism, 90 of them are going to say what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours. Well, that's great up to a point, isn't it? I mean, when you carry that to its logical extension, you lose the moral underpinning of a society. And in fact, people have asked me all the time, Dave, why aren't you a member of the Libertarian Party? And that's the reason why. Because my religious faith, my religious underpinning, my religious foundation teaches me specifically that anyone who says that, what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours, is just like the people of Sodom. They're self-centered and they don't care about their fellow man, which is in violation of Torah law. So it's incompatible with my faith. That doesn't mean all the ideas of libertarianism are. That doesn't mean all the ideas of the Enlightenment were bad. They weren't. In fact, we were motivated by many of them. But if carried to their logical extreme, which was what happened in France, people start losing their heads, which is what happened. Now, in the middle of all this, the Notre Dame Cathedral was eventually stormed by the people, and it was taken over by the government. And one of the things they did was they set it up, they renamed it the Temple of Reason. They emptied out all of the stuff that was in it to the degree that, well, there were a bunch of statues. There were, I don't know, I've forgotten the number, 23, 25 statues of the kings of Judah aligned around one of the courtyards of Notre Dame. Kings of Judah, not Israel, Judah. I don't want to spend a lot of time on biblical history, but the two separate kingdoms, Israel and Judah. Judah is the kingdom that we think of when we think of the true Israelites. Israel becomes what is known as Samaria later on. But at any rate, these kings of Judah are statued, and they represent, this foundational tradition of religious theocracy and that sort of thing. They hauled these statues out. The French revolutionary government hauled these statues out of the Notre Dame into the main courtyard there in France and beheaded the statues as symbolic of destroying all monarchies everywhere. Monarchies were incompatible with the Enlightenment, so they cut their heads off. Oddly enough, they hid the heads. Nobody knew where they were until about 1999, I think. They found the heads in a Paris mansion. They found them behind a wall somewhere, and so they were able to pull them back out. They also set up what I called the Temple of Reason, where they actually had, I guess the best way to describe it is a cult of reason, where they began to worship not God, although they had a God, they just didn't see him as a redemptive force. And in the middle of Notre Dame, they had this woman, and this is a very sanitized portrayal of what happened there. This woman, Reason, was raised up as the ideals that the French Republic would now worship. And this was inside Notre Dame, folks, which had been devastated. Things had been ripped out. Things had been thrown away. Statues had been beheaded, as I said. And I guess the best way to describe this would be a pagan rite, somewhat similar to those rites where the worship of Baal in Canaan, perhaps Bacchus in Greece and Rome, Diogenes. This was it's very sensuous, very erotic, very orgy-ish. I mean, it was, this is what was happening in the Temple of Reason, which is what Notre Dame had become under the French Revolution. It's influenced America a great deal. You need to understand that. This whole madness that had seized France, this whole ideology of taking the Enlightenment to its absolute extremes, really scared America. I mean, it really did. The United States. President Adams was tasked, Congress presented him with the Alien and Sedition Acts because there were a lot of French refugees, people who had fled the revolution both in France and in Haiti, that had come to America to be safe from the lunacy that had ensued, that had just consumed both the Notre Dame Cathedral and France in general. And so Congress passed these laws that gave the president, John Adams, the right, the power, and most importantly, the decision-making. We've talked about this on Constitution Thursday. The ability to make a finding, the ability to make a decision about who was dangerous and who was not, and what to do about it, whether that was deport them, whether that was imprison them, whatever. And concurrently, they passed that same bill, this law that said you can't criticize the government, because if you criticize the government, well, then you're anti-American. Well, the problem was that, of course, this flies in the face of everything we've said we've believed up to this point. We got a First Amendment that says you can criticize the government. And now here, just a few years later, 8 years later, you got the government reacting to the French Revolution by passing this Alien and Sedition Act. And, of course, Thomas Jefferson and the Democrat Federalists, whatever they called themselves, were livid about this. And in the campaign that followed, the charge was leveled that Thomas Jefferson was basically a French revolutionary and that he was going to bring the tenets of the French Revolution to the shores of the United States. And that if he were elected president of the United States, you could fully expect people to be guillotined in the streets of Washington, well, Philadelphia at that point. But, the ideas were terrifying to the United States. The ideas that the French Revolution had gone to, the ideas that Notre Dame could be turned into the Temple of Reason and that statues could be beheaded as symbolic of all this stuff, was horrifying. Now, in our history, you need to understand that the reaction to that election was exactly what it should have been. We retained our base ideas, and we realized, because we were a thinking people, and we were, as Montague had said, we were a virtuous society, an involved society, and we understood hyperbole when we saw it, and we understood a violation of those constitutional rights which we had established when we saw it, and Adams, unfortunately, fortunately, however you want to look at it, was defeated, a good man. And Congress was overturned. They unelected all those whatever they were, Federalists, I guess, and got rid of them because they had dared to cross the line into what was essentially becoming a theocracy again. Our religion matters. We're anti-Catholic. There was a great deal of that in the United States, and we were going to suppress that. Well, that was reactionary and it went too far, and we weren't going to have that. What you need to understand is that we saw that and were able to push back against that, and we did so. But in France, it took a dictator, it took Napoleon Bonaparte to put the crown on his own head to restore order. Or did it? Throughout all of this, the idea of the Enlightenment was that somehow or another we would stamp out Catholicism in France. We would do away with religion. But again, it's hard to do that because you do away with that moral underpinning. You do away with that basis for ideology that Enlightenment has really never been able to offer. And throughout the early 1800s, it became clear that most Frenchmen, while they certainly had beefs with the church, they certainly had beefs with the abuses of the theocracy, they certainly had beefs with the king, they certainly had criticisms of the way things were being done and the financial burdens that were being laid upon them, they never really walked away from their faith. They never really walked away from what Notre Dame represented to them. And this photo that I'm showing on the video, one of the earliest photographs of the Notre Dame Cathedral, this is in 1845, about 50 years after the French Revolution or so. And it's in the beginning stages of being restored and rebuilt by the French people. It had been devastated. It had been emptied. It had been, desecrated, much as the temple in Jerusalem had been many years before. But it was restored. And even the glory of the Notre Dame Cathedral that maybe you have been to visit really isn't what it was prior to the French Revolution. It's been restored since then. The gargoyles, the famous gargoyles of the Notre Dame Cathedral, many of them were smashed and removed during the French Revolutions. The ones you see today, while weather-beaten and, problematic, and even those, most of them are replacements that were put back into place in the 1840s and 1850s when they began to rebuild the Notre Dame Cathedral and to restore it along with its what it represents, which is this idea of faith and this moral underpinning of how we do things and why we do things. Because without that, when you don't have that, things go crazy. People start getting their heads cut off and people start doing crazy, insane things. And it consumes everything to the point where even the people that were cutting people's heads off end up getting their heads cut off. And through it all, the Notre Dame Cathedral, through all its abuses, through all its desecrations, through all of that, managed to hold together the people of France with this basic moral idea that they would have. Yes, the fire yesterday is devastating. Yes, it destroyed the spires and certainly caused a lot of damage on the interior. But the good news is, as we've seen, coming along here, much of the facility has actually been saved. And we've already seen the relics that were pulled out, so forth and so on. And we've already seen all the people stepping up to say, we're going to rebuild this. The pledges that have been made. I saw Cardinal Dolan yesterday on TV talking about the fact that American Catholics, and I have no doubt about it, one of the most Catholic people I know in Manteca, talking yesterday about, we'll have a fish fry and that'll pay for the whole thing in a weekend. It was kind of a joke, but the reality of it is Notre Dame is coming back. It has lived, it has died, it has resurrected before. It's symbolic of the fact that our history changes us, but it still reminds us that things are going to go forward. Things are going to happen, but we have to remember that there are reasons why we have survived as a species for so long. And it's those base ideas, those basic fundamental moral pinnings from wherever we get them. Faith tends to be the most normal of them. And I know atheists and agnostics will argue, but we're moral people too. But again, without religion, where do you define those from? Human nature doesn't support the idea. It's still there. Roman Catholicism came back in France, and while it was never allowed to again become a theocracy, the people managed to restore themselves. And they did it again after World War II. And they'll do it again this time. Notre Dame will be back. And once again, we'll talk about what happens when ideas go too far. And I don't think that's a bad thing. Even though we may have lost some treasures, we still have them deep in our collective hearts. I got to get running. Take the time right now. Tell the people that matter in your life you love them very much. You'd miss them if they weren't there, so don't pass up those opportunities. You don't want to have that regret. Plausibly Live, I'm Dave Bowman. This is my show, The Dave Bowman Show, right here on the Podcast 99 Internet Radio Network. Have a great day, everybody, and we will see you probably tomorrow. I can't guarantee it, but we're going to try. Have a great day, everybody.
The Dave Bowman Show is a Slippery Fish Entertainment production for the Podcast 99 Internet Radio Network. For more information or to complain about how the show offended you, the text or voicemail number is 209-565-DAVE. For more information about the show, log on to thedavebowmanshow.com.
Hey, I'm going to go do something productive. I'm going to go watch television.